Many years ago, there was a fine young adventurer named Jack the Tim. No one knows how Jack got his surname, but there are some legends. The most prevalent legend goes that one day he was speeding down the road and had to swerve to avoid a squirrel. The squirrel, in return, pledged a life debt to him and gave him her surname, the Tim. So basically he married a squirrel, but that's a story for a different day. Anyway, one day Jack was driving down the road and he came across a truck in a tree. How unusual, he thought. What a perfect day to climb, was his second thought. Now, Jack the Tim was an avid climber. He would climb anything. Houses, walls, castles, even trees. Another legend states that Jack the Tim was half cat on his mother's side, but nobody could prove that for sure throughout his entire life. All that they knew was that he liked to climb things. And this truck and this tree were no exception. Now, what fascinated Jack the most about this particular tree and this particular truck was A, how high the truck had gone up into the tree, and B, the fact that it said wizard on either side of the truck. So Jack began to climb the tree, knowing that there were a few types of wizards, and a few types of wizards you didn't want to cross. There were the good wizards and the kind of good wizards who were okay to cross, and then there were the kind of bad and then really bad wizards who were not good to cross. He hoped that the wizard inside, if there was one, was a good wizard and one that was okay to cross. And so he tapped on the window, and out burst a flaming dragon. That answered his question. A fireball hit Jack the Tim straight in the chest, knocking out 3 of his 9 lives, because, hey, half cat, right? And he fell into the bed of a flatbed truck. "Get in, loser! We're going shopping!" shouted the driver of the truck from inside the cab so loudly that the whole truck shook. And she and Jack the Tim drove away. "Where are we going?" asked Jack the Tim. "To my master's house," she said. "There you will learn the ways of the arts of magic." "What arts of magic?" he asked. "The arts of magic that'll save your skin the next time a fire-breathing dragon comes after you," the driver replied. He sighed. "I guess I'm gonna have to do this, because there's no way I'm going back there with that rampaging dragon, and plus, this is the quickest way to the next town." And so they drove, and they drove, and they drove, until the sun started to go down. And then they turned the corner and entered a magnificent cave. The cave was filled with treasure. Gold, silver, rubies, diamonds, platinum. A bunch of food, too, which Jack the Tim liked and could get behind. And so they got out of the truck, and Jack the Tim saw the driver of the truck for the first time. She was a squirrel. Now, Jack the Tim had no idea how a squirrel could drive a car, but he didn't ask questions because, hey, there was food there. And so they got out and began to chow down. The squirrel ate acorns, and Jack the Tim ate pasta, because he liked pasta, and pasta was good. And then he heard a booming voice from the opposite side of the cave. "Who goes there?" the voice shouted. "Me!" squeaked the driver of the truck. "Hi!" Jack the Tim shouted, reckless as ever. "Annie, I see you brought a guest," the bearer of the voice said. "I did! Yes, sir! Yes, sir, I did!" Annie said excitedly. Jack the Tim just waved weakly, and more weakly as the bearer of the voice stepped into view. He was a giant, about 7 feet tall, maybe 7.5 or 8, actually, with long brown hair and bright blue eyes. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Tim. Mr. the Tim, Mr. I don't know," the giant said, squeezing Jack the Tim's hand and nearly jerking him off his feet. "The Tim works fine," Jack the Tim said. "Pleasure to meet you, I guess. What am I doing here?" The giant smiled, took his hand, and placed a small amulet in it. "This will protect you," the giant said. "I am Wizard Dree." "Nice to meet you, Wizard Dree," Jack the Tim said. "Doesn't that sound a lot like wizardry?" Yes, it does," the wizard said. "I'm just going to call you the wizard for now," Jack the Tim said. "Works well for me." And the wizard took Jack the Tim and Annie under his wing from then on and began to teach them the magic arts. They learned everything except for the ways of the dark side, which wizardry would not teach them. When Jack the Tim asked about the stack of dark books on Wizard Dree's table, Wizard Dree said, "Those are forbidden. Never touch them. They are of the dark side." Jack the Tim nodded weakly, feeling sick to his stomach. He didn't want to have anything to do with the dark side. But he progressed rapidly, learning magic from the stage of a very beginner, progressing toward expert very, very quickly. Annie, too, began to grow. Her growth was slower. She didn't learn as fast and specialized in plants and not in general magic. But she had been learning for a long time, and her garden that she grew was fantastic. Jack the Tim tried to make his power focus on climbing, but Wizard Dree said that he was not ready for that yet. Instead, he made him focus on more general magic, like making potions, using his enhanced senses, and flying, because although flying was an advanced art, it required intense focus, which was something that Jack the Tim lacked. So, Wizard Dree put him on that task, having him levitate just a little bit at first, and then go higher and higher and higher and higher, until he could touch the lowest cloud. Now, since this was such an advanced skill, it drained him, and he didn't have the ability to run around and climb like he used to. Wizard Dree was fine with that, because he was planning something. And what he was planning was huge, for it required taking over the kingdom and the help of his apprentices. Now, what Jack the Tim didn't realize was that when he had signed the contract making him an apprentice to Wizard Dree, he had agreed to follow Wizard Dree anywhere and do whatever he said, even if it meant going to the dark side. Now, Annie knew what Wizard Dree was planning, and she was talking to Wizard Dree about everything Jack the Tim did. And Jack the Tim didn't know this at all. And so he went about his daily work while Annie and Wizard Dree conspired. And on the last night of the month, in the afternoon of the last night of the month, they got together and forced Jack the Tim to come with them. Wizard Dree buttered Jack the Tim up with compliments, telling him that he was the finest apprentice he'd ever had, and that he was going to do great things, but Jack the Tim felt sick to his stomach. He couldn't realize what was happening, because he had no idea what they'd been planning, but he had inklings. He knew, from listening in late at night with his sharp hearing, and climbing over walls when he could, that Wizard Dree was planning something huge. But he didn't count on having to come with. Now, Jack the Tim had a very, very, very pure heart. And he'd also been a professional skeet shooter before this whole debacle had happened with the wizard. File that away. That's important. But what they didn't realize while they were planning and scheming was that there was a small squirrel following behind them from several hundred feet away, dressed in fireproof armor and ready for battle. This was Jack the Tim's squirrel wife, ready to defend him to the end, and wondering why in the world he had disappeared for 3 years and left his skeet gun with her. He couldn't shoot skeet. She was a squirrel, for crying out loud, and squirrels don't have opposable thumbs. And so she strapped the gun onto her back and made the long journey to where Jack the Tim was traveling, and decided that she would give it back that very night. Speaking of traveling, while Wizardry, Annie, and Jack the Tim were traveling down the road, Jack's feeling of dread increased, and he said, "I can't do this anymore, guys. I'm out. I don't know what you're doing, but this is wrong." And then Wizardry looked him in the eye, cackled. "You signed an agreement, son, saying that you'd go with me wherever I needed you to." "I didn't sign that agreement," Jack the Tim said. "Yes, you did," Wizardry said, holding up a sheet of paper. "Now, let's go take over the kingdom." Jack protested again, and they put him in handcuffs and marched him to the capital city some 2 miles away, and threw him in a dungeon since he wouldn't cooperate. And while he was in the prison cell, he heard a scampering above him that sounded like little paws. And then he heard the thud of men falling on the ground, and shouts, and a clamor. And then the door fell in. And standing on this door was none other than his squirrel wife. "Alberta!" he shouted. "I've missed you!" "I've missed you too," Alberta said, handing him his gun. "Where have you been?" Places," he said, taking the gun. "Let's get out of here. We can talk later," Alberta said. "Your wizard's about to go all dragon on us." "Oh no," Jack the Tim said. "Let's go. I think I know a faster way. I saw it on the way in." And so they went Jack's faster way, which involved jumping several hundred feet over the prison wall, just in time to see the wizard turn into a massive blue dragon, and for darkness to fall on the castle and the capital city. You got anything that'll help with that?" Alberta asked. Let me think," Jack the Tim said. He thought, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought. Jack the Tim racked his brain for something that would save them all. He flipped through possible allergens in his brain, things that Wizardry might be allergic to. And then he remembered Wizardry did not like things happening above his head that he couldn't see. Good thing for Jack the Tim was that he was the long-distance skeet shooting champion of his entire district. And so he said to Alberta, "Get me one of those whirlies." A whirly was a skeet shooting device in the land that spun and spun and spun and spun for an extra time that would allow the skeet shooter to get the rifle ready and shoot it. So Alberta threw the whirly, and it spun like a little helicopter above the dragon's head. And so Jack the Tim readied his rifle, fired, and then there was an ear-splitting crack, and the dragon was so startled about what was going on above his head that he shrank back into a man and became Wizardry once more. And then he was defeated, locked up, put away, in jail for the rest of his life, because Jack the Tim and Alberta the Tim had saved the day. As for Annie, she was never seen or heard from again. And Jack the Tim and Alberta the Tim enjoyed many more climbing fests, skeet tournaments, and a happy life together. The end.